Good morning and welcome to the Power to Change webinar on Common Good Land Use in England. I'm Natasha Bright, the Communications Manager at Power to Change, and I'm joined today by Kim Graham from Shared Assets and Gareth Roberts, the founding member and Business Development Manager at WeGather Sheffield. So Kim co-authored the Common Good Land Use State of the Sector report, and today Kim's going to be talking about their findings from the workshops with community businesses, as well as the idea behind Common Good Land Use and how community businesses can work to fulfil its potential. Shared Assets believe Common Good Land Use can be a starting point for tackling a range of societal issues, including the climate crisis and food insecurity. So just a few technical things for me before I pass you on to Kim. You can read the full report and a blog on our website, that's www.powertochange.org.uk. We are going to be recording the webinar, so no need to worry about taking any notes, and the recording will be sent out to all registered attendees afterwards. So if people haven't managed to make it here today, they'll get a recording of it. There is going to be an opportunity to ask questions, so please feel free to do so. The questions box should be on your screen, and we'll try and answer as many as possible. But any additional questions we can answer by email afterwards. So I'm going to hand you over now to Kim, who's going to be speaking for approximately 40 minutes.
Thanks, Natasha. Hi, everyone, and thanks very much for joining the webinar today. So as Natasha said, my name is Kim. I'm the research coordinator for Shared Assets. And we are a CIC, a non-profit social enterprise trying to create a more equitable land system in the UK. And we do this through supporting communities, through conducting research pieces like the one I'm going to be discussing today, and working closely with land professionals who are people like developers and local authorities involved in working on the land, as well as through policy and advocacy work, which we base on our research and our work with communities. So one of the key ways that we do this work is through the idea of talking about common land use. It's kind of a theme that comes up again and again. And that's obviously what the report I'm going to be talking about today focuses on. So I just thought before we start, it's probably a good idea to go through what we think of as common good land use. So if we can just move on to the next slide, great. So this slide kind of gives a bit of a summary of what Shared Assets thinks of as common good land use. So it's made up of these sort of 6 components. So first of all, we think that people should be able to make a living from the land. And that doesn't have to just be farming, it can be all sorts of other things, but we think that land should be productive in that way. But at the same time, we don't think that sense of productivity should compromise its environmental well-being, its biodiversity and everything else. So we think of productivity in perhaps a slightly different way than you might normally hear it, which is not only that it produces, food and ecosystem kind of services, but also social and cultural things that people need, recreational spaces to connect with nature and feel well and healthy. So that's what we mean when we talk about productivity. And then that again links to this 4th idea of shared benefits, which is the idea that land produces things that all sorts of people need. It shouldn't just be kind of the landowner who is gaining the benefits from it, but it should be for the good of the whole community. And related to that, point 5 is that we think that communities should have some control or decision-making power over the land close to them. And there's all sorts of different models for that. Whether it's a community land trust or a Friends of a Park group, all sorts of different models, but we think that the people living near a piece of land should have some say in what it's used for and how it's controlled. And then finally, we see all these kind of little patches of land which are being used in this sort of common good way, as adding up to more of the sum of their parts, to kind of reframing the whole conversation that we have about land in this country, that it should be used for the common good as opposed to individual purpose, and really that it's one of the key social justice issues of our time. We kind of see land as the fundamental thing which underlies a lot of other issues, and so if we change how we think about land and how it's controlled, we can have a broad impact on lots of other issues, like yeah, our food system, climate change, environmental improvement, all sorts of things, sense of community. So through our work, we kind of know that there are lots of people out there who are using land in broadly this sense of the common good, or they're at least aspiring to do so. But there's actually very little data on it, which is one of the reasons we set out to do this piece of research. But if we just move on to the next slide quickly. So yeah, from an organizational perspective of shared assets, these are kind of our aims. We want to support common good land users, so people trying to meet kind of any of those 6 things that I just talked about, and also to create the conditions in which common good land users can thrive. And if we move on to the next slide, just show you. So, and I appreciate this is a little bit hard to read, but just to kind of summarize, this is the way that shared assets work. So on the left-hand side, you have this green sort of panel, which shows common good land users, so those are the people that I've just described. So we work with them, offering sort of advice services, sort of things around like business development for community businesses, advice on land tenure, all sorts of things, kind of working directly with them and connecting them to each other so they can support each other. Then in the middle, we have land professionals. So like I said, these might be people like developers or landowners, people generally working with land in some way, but not directly on the land, who have a lot of the kind of control and power over decisions, often which affect the people on the left-hand side, things like planning and funding. So we have to engage those people in the middle so that the common good land users can kind of benefit from a more supportive environment. And then finally, on the right-hand side, this is kind of our policy and advocacy work, and also with kind of larger investors and funding bodies to get land as something that can be funded kind of up the agenda and shout about how important it is. So we're able to do that work because of the close connections that we have with people directly working on the land. But those people are often so busy with their kind of day-to-day work that they don't always have the chance or the energy to put into that kind of broader scale advocacy work. So we try and do that for them in a sense. So that's the sort of ways that we kind of create this supportive environment around people working on the land. But yeah, just to move on to the research. So if we go on to the next slide. Yeah, so for most of this year, we've been working on this research piece to really kind of get a snapshot of what the sector of common good land users in England looks like. So first of all, I actually wanted to ask you 2 questions. So before we just move on to the research, thinking about the common good land use that I've just described, thinking about your own work or perhaps the people that you work with, would you consider yourself to be a common good land user? I'd be interested to hear your responses. We're hopefully going to have a little poll on screen in a second. So yeah, what do you think? And this might be something that we come back to, why you would or wouldn't think of yourself as a common good land user in the questions afterwards. Cool. So once you finished answering that one, and just before we move on to the kind of research itself, one of the things that we kind of have found throughout the research is that land is something, and through our work more generally, to be honest, is that land is something that's not really talked about very much. So I'm also interested in why you think land is not talked about more. I've given a few options there, that it's very complex to talk about, that it's kind of invisible in lots of discussions, or that it's not relevant. But yeah, again, we'll be interested to hear your thoughts. And if you have other thoughts on why it's not talked about more, you can put those in the chat box and we can discuss those more later. Great. So just coming back to the research, so yes, we've been doing it for most of this year to try and get more data on this sector, and often the data that does exist is kind of fragmented. So this is the sort of thing I mean by the land being a bit invisible. Basically, some of the existing data that we have on these sort of community businesses and people using the land in this way is often divided between lots of different categories. So just to take the example of the the kind of annual Power to Change community business report, research reports, quite often people who use the land in sort of a common good way are split between different sectors. So there's they might be split between people working in the environment, people working in the arts, people working on health and social care. So there's all these sorts of categories which kind of divide up the sector. So it's difficult to find data which is specifically about common good land users. So that's kind of what we were setting out to do. So we did an online survey, we did some interviews, more in depth with people, and then we did a series of workshops. So we did one in Bristol, one in London, and one actually at Regather in Sheffield. And those were really useful for kind of getting a bit more depth on the online survey that we did. So about 100 people participated in total, which is based on the sort of data that we could find, we would estimate that's about 10% of the sector. So there's probably about 900 to 1,000 groups in England kind of using land in this way. So yeah, so we wanted to find out more about them, and you can see some pictures from the workshops there. But yeah, if we move on to the next slide. So what were some of the key findings that we came up with? Well, first of all, we found out that common good land users are generally managing very small parcels of land. So we kind of categorize small as under 10 hectares, but quite often they were much smaller pieces of land than that. Although it is worth mentioning that some, especially kind of big forest projects, were operating at a much bigger scale. So there is that range, but in general, people were managing very small parcels of land. The kind of most frequent types of land that we found were woodland, horticultural land, or parks and open spaces. But quite frequently, even on very small parcels of land, groups would have different types of land that they were working with. We also find out that these sorts of land users are very dependent on freelance staff or part-time staff and volunteers. There's very little well-paid, full-time, secure work in this sector. And often volunteers are kind of asked to do things which might well, be equivalent to at least one person's full-time job, if not a couple of people. So yeah, that kind of relates to the next point down, which is that these organizations are usually working with very small budgets and surpluses. So there's not a lot of spare cash around to kind of spend paying people, basically. So if we move on to the next slide, yeah. So other results, we find that common good land users are often earning their income through selling products and services. That might be things like fruit and veg from a sort of veg co-op, or it might be woodland products, or it might be things like well-being courses, or specialist kind of educational courses for vulnerable groups, perhaps with a local council, something like that. But they're also reliant on grants and fundraising, and not all common good land users are at the stage where they kind of have a product or a service that they've got kind of packaged up and ready to sell. So quite often they are dependent on applying for funds from big grant making organizations. They also manage a mix of legal organizational forms and relationships to the land. And quite often this can be tricky because these are some very technical areas, and people, kind of lay people just who want to do something in their community don't have the expertise required to kind of pick the best type of form for them, or the best form of tenure for their project right at the start. So those can sometimes evolve throughout the project, and it can be a bit tricky to change sometimes if you don't kind of pick the right one at the start. Also, this was a really interesting finding, especially for us as a kind of support organization, is that common good land users are really connected to their local communities and draw on them much more for advice and support than they do for kind of national or regional bodies like Power to Change or Shared Assets or Plunkett Foundation or the Forestry Commission, National Trust, all these kind of big bodies that might support them. they're much more likely to go to their local communities first to draw on advice and support. And that's really because of, as you might expect, those people having more local contextual knowledge and often can get things done faster than kind of bigger organizations. But having said that, when people do need external support, it is often for the more technical issues that I just mentioned, like legal advice on land law or tenure. And they are most in need of skilled staff and secure funding streams. That's kind of their biggest desire to have, or the thing that would change what they're doing most in the years to come. So if we just move on to the next slide. So I just wanted to throw in this map very quickly. This kind of shows the distribution of responses that we had for the survey. And as you can see, we have also included some people from Northern Ireland and Scotland and Wales who very kindly took the time to answer our survey as well. The report itself focuses on just England because that's kind of Part of Change's funding focus. But in the online data set that's available and the kind of network map that we did, showing all the connections between groups, and this map as well, we've included all their results because, yeah, it's really interesting as well. And that could be something to look into for further research, is the kind of comparisons between England and other countries. So, yeah. So after all the kind of results and research, we came up with a few recommendations which we thought could help kind of push forward the common good land use sector. And if you want to kind of share these very quickly, you might have seen already, as well as the report, we produced this kind of series of 4 quick guides, as we're calling them, for various groups involved in common good land use. So those are really easily shareable, and there's links at the end if you want to look at those or share them with your networks. So the first set here is for people who want to create common good land use projects. So they might not be involved in it yet, but you've seen a bit of land in your community. You think it would be great if something happened there. So we thought it's important to also engage those people because we want to expand this sector. So first of all, it's really important to be clear about your purpose and build in time at the start of the project to kind of reflect upon that purpose and how you might achieve it. Yeah, there's so many people out there doing lots of great work, and you want to kind of complement what's already going on or enhance that in some way, as opposed to just repeating effort. And that also relates to the second point about visiting existing projects and asking them what has not gone well for them, what's been challenging. People often, are a little bit reluctant to talk about those things, but one of the things that really came out of the workshops was that kind of people who are already using land for the common good or are hoping to wish there were more of those spaces to ask those kind of challenging questions and talk about failures. I think there's often this sort of perception that projects, especially with such insecure funding, have to kind of present a very positive picture the whole time to funders and to make it look like everything's going fine to keep those funding streams coming in. But really, most of the learning comes from learning where things didn't go so well. So it's worth kind of, connecting with other people in your community and asking them some tricky questions or how they might do things differently if they started again, as you hope to. And yeah, the third point there, it is really worth putting time into researching the best land tenure and legal structure for your organization. Often these things, in terms of land tenure, can start off as quite informal arrangements between a kind of sympathetic landowner and a community group that approaches them. But it is a good idea to kind of get a sort of formal written document down, just so that everybody knows their kind of rights and responsibilities right at the start, and there's no confusion about that. And in terms of a legal structure, you kind of want to choose something that gives you flexibility as your project grows to, that might be to sell products or to, basically just give you the flexibility to take on a range of different activities that you need to kind of keep things going. So if we move on to the next slide. Cool. So for people already using the land for the common good, we recommended, obviously we saw the importance of networks already, but we also thought it's good to kind of look beyond the people you would normally talk to build a broader base of support. So that might be something like approaching a local lawyer or accountants to see if they can do any kind of pro bono work for you, which might save you a lot of time doing accounts and things like that. So people not directly connected to the land necessarily, but who might be able to support your initiative. Also consider cross-subsidizing. So some of the most kind of successful common good land users have this model where there are some elements of their projects which are, really for a social purpose or to reach the most vulnerable people. And those are never going to make a profit, and they shouldn't be expected to. That's not their purpose. But those sometimes can be quite hard to raise money for. So it's important that other elements of your project can support those. So there might be, a kind of more business oriented side and then the more social oriented side. So yeah, it's worth kind of not having your eggs all in one basket in that sense. And then also think widely about how you can demonstrate your impact. Because often, the impacts of a well-managed green space can be a bit hard to quantify through sort of numbers and figures and things like that. You can know from your own experience that it's really, say your community garden is really making a big impact on local people's mental health or their access to fresh food, things like that. So it's worth putting a bit of time into thinking about the different, maybe more creative methods that you can use to show how you are having an impact. And that might be, through storytelling, through more artistic projects. But yeah, kind of, if you can get that, your sort of overall story of the change you're making together, that can be, appealing to funders. So yeah, if we move on. Cool. So obviously another big group to reach out to is landowners. So we find in the workshops and things that lots of people who are interested in working on the land spend a lot of time trying to find a kind of sympathetic landowner to work with. And data on land is so, it's not transparent at all. It's often very hidden. So you can obviously go through the land registry, but that costs money. And quite often, even if you do pay for land registry details, they don't really give you much, or the owner's not even known sometimes. So basically, it's very helpful if landowners themselves can kind of come forward and express their interest in working with people, kind of using land in this way. But it's also important to be very specific about the type of land you have to offer and any restrictions you might have on how it's used, so that you kind of don't waste each other's time at the start. Also, common good land users shouldn't be treated like standard commercial partners. So this particularly, so one big landowner obviously is local authorities. And it's commonplace sometimes for local authorities to ask people, commercially trying to buy land or access land to pay the local authorities legal costs. But for a very small kind of non-profit organisation, as these common good land users often are, that can be, far too expensive to do. So we'd like to see landowners kind of taking the pressure off in that sense, and offering advice to people who don't have that same sort of expertise in as a standard commercial partner might have in things like land law and finances, to kind of help them make their claim for things. And finally, as I said, these things often start quite informally, but it is useful to set out everybody's rights and responsibilities in a written document right at the start. And that helps, especially if there's kind of a change in personnel from the common good land users side, or from the landowner side, to be honest, that everybody still knows where they stand, and it can keep going throughout time, even if people change and move on. So if you move to the next slide. So coming on to policymakers, as I said just there now, land data is very difficult to come by, and even when it is available, it's not very detailed. You might not be able to know the type of soil or the relief, or lots of things which are quite important for things like food growing. So if policymakers could push for more transparent and detailed information on land to be readily available, that would really be helpful for common good land users. Also, kind of strengthening community right to buy legislation in England would be very useful. This is something that Scotland especially is much further ahead on than England is. Of course, you do have the sort of assets of community value route, but that's a very kind of long-winded process, and only kind of gives people the option to potentially bid for things if they're to ever come up for sale. So it's not as strong as some of the legislation in Scotland. And the land fund that we're talking about there, that would be the idea of kind of a body that could maybe hold bits of land which could be used for the common good, and people could just come on and use it and access it without having to worry about all the sort of tenure and ownership issues that can slow people down. So that could be another option. And finally there, make ecologically sound and socially valuable land management material considerations in planning decisions. So quite often the planning system really struggles with common good land users because they're often very multifunctional, and that sort of multifunctionality can be a bit confusing because it means that they sometimes need planning permission for things like toilet blocks or access roads, which might not immediately, planners may not immediately understand why those are important for things like food growing. But if you're hosting, people on site or educational groups, things like that, that can all be very important. So as well as the kind of just the land base of things, it would be good if kind of ecology and the social value of land management could also be included in planning decisions. And then finally, we have some recommendations for funders on the next slide. So it would be really helpful if more funders were kind of up to speed on common good land use, because quite often groups find themselves having to sort of package themselves up in various ways to meet different funding pots. And it would be great if really funders could be led by what these groups say they need and offer long-term support to fulfill their objectives. Because yeah, when we're talking about land, these are often very long cycles and projects that we're talking about, whether that's because of crop rotation or anything else. So the sort of 1, 2, 3 year funding cycles are often not really appropriate for that. So yeah, we'd like to see sort of more long-term funding there. Also, yeah, look to build on the networks and connections that already exist in local communities rather than just creating new support program after new support program. There's already clearly very strong networks around these common good land users, but there's more work to do there, and there's more work to do in connecting common good land users with each other locally and kind of sharing and learning from each other. So ways to kind of support those from funders would be really helpful. And yeah, as I said, funding multi-year costs is important, but core costs as well as project costs, would really support growth and sustainability of these projects. And that includes things like staffing to challenge the sort of reliance that the sector has at the minute on volunteers or kind of low paid or temporary staff to really make it viable for people to work on the land in the long term, basically. So that's kind of a lot of information that I've dumped on you a little bit there, but I thought that it would be really good to kind of hear from someone who is doing this day to day, which is why we're delighted to have Gareth from Regather join us on the call. So he'll kind of talk about what they do a bit more in detail, but just as a brief introduction, Regather is a co-op in Sheffield, and it has a building which hosts lots of community events and is available for hire, but it also runs a veg box scheme and is setting up a farm and has a microbrewery. So lots of enterprises kind of going on in the same site or sites. So yeah, I'll hand over to Gareth to kind of add his reactions to the report and share his experiences.
Hi, good morning. Can you hear me okay? Just to confirm that.
Yeah.
Excellent, great. Hi folks. So yeah, my name's Gareth and I'm the co-founder of Regather here in Sheffield. And yeah, it's great to be able to put some thoughts into the mix following the release of the reports here from Shared Assets. Yeah, I suppose there's a number of things that are very relevant to what Kim's just outlined from our perspective. Thought it might be useful just to briefly outline the story really as to how we've ended up with 14 acres of agricultural land, peri-urban location in the Moss Valley, which is a small river valley just on the outskirts of Sheffield, in between Sheffield and Chesterfield, so just over the border into northeast Derbyshire. And yeah, I mean, I'm not going to tell the whole story because it actually spans about 10 years, and is a product of a whole series of developments that ultimately are now resulting in the opportunity for Regather to really engage in land-based food production. Woodland enterprise will be a feature going forward. But I suppose the broad observation to make about that experience, and this is one, the observation here is one that I think is widely shared. I do spend a fair amount of time visiting other organisations who do similar things to what we're doing. I've been down to Growing Communities organically and Sutton Community Farm in different parts of London. Attended the Community Supported Agriculture Network AGM, and we're members as well, so talked to a lot of their members. We're members of the Land Workers Alliance and have been to their AGM recently, and we've also been attending the Oxford Real Farming Conference for the past at least the past couple of years, representing Regather. And broadly, the observation is that everybody doing this in some form or another is a product of very exceptional circumstances, and that is the case across the board. There is no consistent policy-based or practice-based approach, it seems, and I think this is where the Shared Assets report is very welcome and does start to identify both what that pathway might be, but also more importantly, what the barriers are, to that pathway being accessible, if you like, to new entrants into this sector. And I think that so there's that observation about exceptional circumstances. Then I suppose moving on for us, there's obviously the benefit of a report, like the Shared Assets report, setting out, clearly what almost the ideal should be, and modelling that provides us with something that we can kind of compare to and benchmark against. But that's quite a harsh. There's a harsh reality, basically. When you look at the model and the kind of the ideal practice versus the kind of the reality that exists out there, I suppose the second key observation would be to say that unfortunately we're a very, very, very long way off that model, and that ideal that is absolutely necessary in order for this type of common good land use to flourish. And essentially, because of the really challenging environment that we operate in, and our experience certainly with Regather here in Sheffield, is that we essentially, we occupy this kind of niche within a niche, and therefore, the existence that we have to maintain is really challenging, essentially. And I suppose, with it, just to share maybe the experience that we've had with that 10-year process in Sheffield, because we were well ahead of any particular curve, just to sort of in the scheme of things, we were literally years and years ahead of where the city has now kind of in some form or another arrived at. So what we have now is something called the Outdoor City, which is essentially a marketing vehicle for promoting Sheffield as a destination to primarily visitors, but also to the kind of residents of the city. And that promotes the city as a place for running, walking, climbing, and cycling. And this is a very positive development in all sorts of different ways, and we welcome it completely. But we also have been very clear to make the observation to those responsible for developing the Outdoor City agenda It's simply that those activities essentially emphasise the kind of leisure and amenity value of the landscape that is the Sheffield landscape, as opposed to the kind of primary economic function of that landscape, which is actually much more about that landscape as a productive landscape, and that's been our kind of, if you like, our way in to engaging with the Outdoor City agenda and promoting a more productive landscape. There are lots of examples in Sheffield. We're very fortunate that we're not alone in making that argument, and there are a number of organisations who recognise different approaches that can be taken. So whether that's just to highlight a couple, Green Estate, that they are leaders in the sort of pictorial meadows. So this is producing certain seed mixes for grass and flower meadowscapes, and that's something that's been very widely sort of picked up and recognised. We also have like Healy Trust, and their work with the Healy People's Park. So the lovely expanse of public parkland. And the list goes on, but there's that relationship with a productive landscape. But ultimately, that's a challenging path, even when there are some good practice examples. So from our point of view, it's much more food focused, and we're essentially our journey. To sort of summarise it, we set up a fruit and veg box. Then that has developed. It's primarily about home delivery. So our customer base are households, and we're selling organic fruit and vegetables into those households. And that has developed over time. And broadly, the opportunity that we're looking to realise going forward is very simply laws of supply and demand. So those households, the demand for locally grown organic produce significantly outstrips the current level of supply of that type of product, and the challenge there is finding land in order to develop and that supply. It's simple, you can explain it in 10 seconds, but the reality of making that happen obviously involves a whole range of factors that make it something that unfortunately can take a long time. So the land that we've now got, we have it under a 20-year farm business tenancy agreement, and as I mentioned earlier about this sort of set of exceptional circumstances, so that land is owned by a social enterprise. So our landlord is a social enterprise, and that social enterprise is has been set up by individuals who live and work in Sheffield, and for various reasons I'll not sort of go into a huge amount of detail because there's simply not the time, basically. But essentially they created the opportunity to buy that land from a local farmer, and that local farmer is essentially divesting various packets of land over a period of time because he has no succession plan for his farm. It was a dairy farm originally, but then it's moved into arable. But as he's grown older, he's now looking to dispose of the land. So the relationship with that farmer was absolutely critical, and that relationship started over nearly a decade ago now. And one of the first kind of moves that collectively we made, engaging that community, that agricultural community, was very interesting. It was an oral history project, and it was initiated by an individual in our group. And this is sort of pre-Regather. This is when we were exploring community-supported agriculture in the Moss Valley, very, very early stages of the Making Local Food Work programme. So we're going back in time now. But that oral history project built the relationship with the farming community there. And, that then led to the dialogue which created the opportunities for that land to be purchased by concerns that, parties that were more concerned with agroecological food-based production rather than commodity, agriculture, industrialized agriculture, or whatever, conventional farming, basically. So these are the exceptional circumstances, and we are, very much a case study of that. In terms of, us as a community benefit society, Regather as a trading business, we face all sorts of challenges because of the nature of grant funding and the criteria that is attached to grant funding. Whoever the grant funder is, it doesn't very often fit the type of, if you like, the economic reality of scaling up a community food business that is about providing food into households. I suppose essentially it's a more market-driven reality. And in order to grow the right stuff and sell it at the right price to the right customers, and where those customers are and so on, we end up tapping into a market, a customer base that is essential to our existence, but that doesn't tick the boxes. And this is why, particularly in Sheffield, we have a really robust sort of therapeutic horticulture or kind of social farming sector. But essentially, they're growing people, not food. And this is a really integral challenge, for community food businesses. How do you strike that balance between kind of market-driven scaling up, impact on the food system, which ultimately really is the goal here, versus a kind of more maybe social outcomes and primarily funding-driven environment where the outcomes are people and people who are enriched and skills are developed and disadvantages are addressed and so on. And it's not that one is any better than the other. It's just that the environment in which certain types of business can exist sort of tends to lead towards the more sort of socially driven model, particularly where there's grant funding available, versus the market-driven kind of reality. And it's weird. You become victims of your own success, really. How we have to then scale up that community food business activity becomes challenging. So we have 350 or so box customers a week. So that's 350 households into which we are supplying fruit and veg, along with a bunch of other extras. So that's a drop in the ocean, compared to the city's population, which is coming towards 600,000 people. And obviously then, the reality of the geography of that scaling up, involves pockets of land in multiple locations that mean we cover, from an administrative geography point of view, if you're talking to the local authority, they say, oh, which ward or which neighbourhood are you talking about here? And we have to give them a very long list. And in some cases, because of the kind of relationship between urban and peri-urban land, it might be that our kind of main production site is actually just outside of their local authority area as well. So that doesn't fit, basically, and it doesn't fit quite often with how funding organisations have to administrate their funds as well. So there's still, unfortunately, structural barriers that exist, not just in the kind of conventional business as usual kind of commercial elements of land-based activity, but there's also still structural barriers within the, if you like, the support mechanisms. I think that's very clearly acknowledged in the report with the recommendations to funders. So there's still lots of good work happening, but still a huge amount still to be done to essentially make the norm, if you like. So making what we're trying to achieve here not about niches within niches, not about entirely exceptional circumstances, but about a pathway that can be identified and followed, particularly by young people who want to move into this line of work as a career choice, as a way of life, if you like, and making that a reality, as opposed to an unachievable model, which unfortunately I think is a criticism that can too easily be made of the kind of the ideal state that we're trying to say we're trying to achieve here, because there's a harsh reality. So yeah, I think that's where I'll maybe draw things to a close and keep an eye on the time. I see it's 10:02, but yeah, maybe not as optimistic as as I'd like it to be, but equally, acknowledging the challenges that we're facing, because we want to be successful, and we all want this to be successful. But the question is, how do we make that happen?
Thanks very much, Gareth. That was really helpful to especially that point about kind of making places like Regather or wherever not the exception but the norm. That's essentially what we want to achieve, and hope this report will kind of be a small step towards, because at the minute it really does feel, if you ask some of these places which have been relatively more successful, they all have stories like the one Gareth just shared of connections that have kind of been nurtured over years and years and eventually have kind of come through to something good. But for somebody just starting out, that can just seem like, oh, you were so lucky, like how did that happen? So that's why it is important that we try and break down these structural barriers, which are preventing many more people from getting involved in this sort of work and being successful in it. So just to kind of wrap up quickly before we move on to questions, you can see on the slide there that kind of this research project has provoked a lot more ideas for us of where to kind of take this next. And just to put a couple up there, there's certainly a lot more kind of practical and research projects which could be done through things like community organising around land use, or looking into different business models that work in more depth. The kind, as Gareth was mentioning there, the kind of the balance between the more commercial side of things and the more social side of things. It also, I think, would be really interesting to kind of go in depth into a particular region or city or local authority or something, to kind of really assess how many people are using land for the common good in that area. Because whilst the survey was quite successful and we got quite a few answers to it, we know there's lots of other places which didn't fill in the survey. So yeah, it would be good to kind of do that on the ground work. And it would be even better if we could really work alongside common good land users themselves to kind of determine what that research looks like, and what issues they would like to investigate themselves. So yeah, we're going to keep kind of shouting about this research, and doing events like the webinar today, and other events to kind of raise awareness about what we're saying on it. And we're really interested in hearing from any of you out there, or anybody who might be interested in kind of taking the next steps with us on this. So yeah, I mean, thanks so much for listening. And if we just skip to the last slide there, you can see the kind of the details of my email address if you want to get in touch with me at all to discuss any part of the report. And there's also the links there to the report and the quick guides, which are really easy to share and look into if you just want a quick summary. So yeah, thanks so much for listening and for joining today, and happy to take any questions that you have.
Great, thank you very much, Kim and Gareth, for sharing his experiences. So we are open now for any questions that you might have. We have got a couple that have come in already. This is for Kim. So are there any other terms that groups, actually for both of you, that other groups use to describe themselves instead of common good land users?
Yeah, well, just to quickly kind of feed in from the research. So we had like quite a lot of discussions about this during the workshops. And yeah, clearly people describe themselves in all sorts of ways, like from just community businesses or social enterprises or community organizations, to some people kind of use the language of like public value and public good. So there were kind of discussions about things like socially valuable land enterprises, that sort of thing. Common good land use is kind of the best catch-all term that we've come up with at the minute, and people did tend to sort of like that idea of it being about land use as opposed to ownership, and kind of, you know, that sort of conjured up these ideas of stewardship for the long term as opposed to just owning something to make money out of it, things like that. But yeah, so we heard a lot of different answers there, and sometimes people called themselves different things, again, to like appeal to certain funders, that sort of thing. So yeah, there's definitely a range of things out there, and we're always open to more suggestions about a more succinct or understandable way to call it. But yeah, common good land use is kind of what we're going with for now. Gareth, I don't know whether you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think from us, the community food business is the one that has resonated most from, you know, both customers and other, I suppose, other stakeholders. I think it's an easy, I suppose it's an easy point to make, particularly if you're looking to, I suppose, detract from, you know, the movement as a whole, and certainly going to some of the more mainstream agricultural conferences and speaking with more conventional, you know, farming, farmers and agricultural practitioners. You know, that it's the quickest way to kind of level a criticism is sort of make a point about what's the latest buzzword, or, you know, what are you calling yourselves now type thing. And I think, you know, when you're inside the sector, when you're a practitioner within it, that's a very easy thing to overlook, because we kind of have our own language and our own particular set of terminologies, which are kind of understandable as to why they exist, but they're not always helpful when you're sort of on the outside looking in, or if you're sort of on the inside trying to break out.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so I think we do only have time for one more question. Sorry, it's we've gone slightly over time. So could you tell us a little bit about what other challenges did groups face, and what other types of support they needed?
Yeah, sure. So as well as, yeah, staff and funding were the ones that came up again and again, but also people had kind of a lot more sort of niche needs, like things like, well, not really niche, but yeah, just people picked lots of different things. So things around transport, you know, whether that's like a vehicle to deliver things like a veg box. Infrastructure improvement kind of came up again and again. And that could be, you know, from anything to kind of like building a little hut to have their meetings in, to well, yeah, things like that were the main things, but also like things like toilets and stuff came up again and again. Those sort of basic infrastructure things, which are really important to have on site, but quite hard to find funding for sometimes. What else? And I guess a lot of the sort of barriers that people faced were challenges turned around, basically. So it's like, we would like to pay our staff, but we don't have the money, that sort of thing. I'm just scrolling down slightly. So yeah, access to land we've kind of talked about a bit. That can be very hard and sort of long and often soul destroying process to go through. Also things, just peer support and relationships was something that came up as well. I think people, yeah, are really interested in kind of seeing each other's projects and learning from each other, but finding the time to do that can be really challenging. And also just, you know, people talked about, even where those relationships are in place, so those networks are in place, they're not always easy sailing. And that can be, you know, just sort of personality clashes, but it can also be, you know, kind of structural inequalities, basically. So things like sexism, racism, kind of playing a role in who gets to speak with authority on these things and who's kind of excluded from those conversations, or their concerns are dismissed as not so relevant. And I think that those sort of the way that, you know, privilege and land and wealth and power all intersect is something that we really need to, you know, be more cognizant of, and especially, you know, when you're just starting up one of these sort of groups, to kind of really look at your own privilege and advantages and think about the ways in which you structure your project and how that will, you know, appeal to certain groups but might also exclude certain groups. I think that's something that we need to, yeah, consider a lot more in this sector. So yeah, those are just some of the other issues that people were facing, but there's lots more in the report.
Right, that's great. Thank you so much, Kim. We do have a couple more questions, but I don't think we do have time to answer them today. So I've made a note of them and we will send it out with a mail out afterwards. But that's it. Thank you all from me, and thanks for joining us on the webinar today.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Bye.